in relation to transhumanism. If you look at the long history, right now, the whole kind of discussion that some people seem to be very interested in is what's the difference between humanism, post-humanism, transhumanism, etc. So what I want to look at is the coming and shaping of what I call techno-fantasy. If one looks at the very, very long history of humans, one can find a rather invariant set of deep fantasies. I'm going to mention only a few of them, but you'll recognize all of them. One of the favorite fantasies that goes way, way back among humans is the fantasy of flying. We all would love to fly. Now, I'm going to look at that in a historical perspective in just a second, but the ability to escape gravity, to fly with ease, has been a very deep and very old kind of human fantasy. Another very old and deep human fantasy is to be invisible. And invisibility fantasies can be found as far back as there is written history. The third, of course, is the most extreme, the fantasy of immortality. Humans seem to want to live forever. Now, look at these three fantasies. First of all, for what they are. First of all, they are deep desires to be effectively disembodied. To fly is to deny a finite, heavy kind of body such as we have. Invisibility, of course, is to deny the corporality of embodiment, etc. And immortality, of course, is to totally deny finitude and contingency. Now, I'm arguing that these fantasies are very, very deep, very, very old, but they take different shapes. If you look at different times, how do you do these three things in fantasy? First, you do it magically, etc. You just do it by... nobody early fantasized a Superman kind of flying, where you just sort of fly all over the place. But early on, you usually have either craft or animal surrogates which allow you to do this. If you fly, perhaps you can find a great big eagle and fly around the world. Or if you have invisibility, you have a cloak which you put around you. Or if you have immortality, well, you have all of these elaborate rituals and fantasies that are built into things like pyramids and so forth. Now, what's interesting about what I'm calling techno-fantasy is these fantasies begin to take different shape beginning roughly around the 12th or 13th century. And they become technological fantasies. Roger Bacon, for example, was the person who began to fantasize magical kinds of machines. He dreamed up machines that could go underwater. He dreamed up tanks. He dreamed up most of the instruments and tools that Da Vinci, 2 centuries later, did drawings of. And so what happens is the fantasies become more and more technologized. Now, is transhumanism something new? I don't think so. I think transhumanism is something very, very old. It has merely given a technological shape to the fantasies that I've been speaking about. Ray Kurzweil, for example, has a big project of trying to resuscitate his father, who died when he was young. He had his body cryogenetically preserved. That turns out to be almost infinitely expensive, and as rich as he is, he decided it was better to have it decapitated and only preserve his head. But now you see, I think these fantasies of resuscitation, invisibility, etc., are actually very old. It's the old desire to escape and deny embodiment. Now I'm going to switch gears and do a post-phenomenological case study, a very personal post-phenomenological case study. In 2010, I took another step towards the inevitable aging cyborg status, and my knees had deteriorated due to osteoarthritis enough that the inside part was bone on bone. The outside part still had plenty of cartilage. So I got 2 implants, prosthetic knees, which were called unicameral compartmental, which means half a knee. And so the cartilage part remained normal, and the other part remained steel and plastic. Now, this was very unusual for my age, which at that point was, I guess, about 78. I'm now 80. Because the history of these top technologies, if you will, was that they were used basically for much, much younger people whose knees had deteriorated from severe sports activity, et cetera, and knee transplants in the early days were known to last for 7 to 10 years. So they knew that if you got this, you'd like to postpone it as long as possible because you can only take so many series of knee transplants. Lesson number 1, technologies are not perfect, as many people want to utopianly realize. They all wear out. I don't think any of your cars have ever lived to be 60 or 70 years old unless you rebuild them from scratch, etc. Technologies simply wear out. And so cyborg technologies also wear out. Well, this is part of the politics that I learned in what happened to me. And almost exactly a year ago, a little bit more than a year ago, I got an infection in my right prosthetic implant. And I was in Vermont, where we always are during the summertime, and the diagnosis was that it was indeed an infection, so what you have to do is to do a very serious culturing to find out what kind of bacteria is doing this. Now, what I'm going to challenge transhumanists with, I've already challenged them by saying there's nothing new in this. They're the oldest fantasizers that you can imagine. They've just technologized it into its contemporary form. Now, and they're of course denying that technologies decline and deteriorate the same as bodies do. So one of the first things that I learned in this process of the infection was that anything that is implanted into a human body attracts a biofilm. The science of microbiota is just a new science. We have trillions of bacteria in our body at any time, and most of them are benign or neutral, and some of them can be aggressively toxic. So one of the worries is if you get any kind of toxic bacteria which is attracted to any kind of implant, which is done flesh, and which you know, of course, obviously, that fleshly transplants are also problems with rejection, etc., etc., etc. So what the orthopedists were worried about is if this is an aggressive bacteria, we've got to get that implant out right away. I have subsequently learned that Donald Davidson, who's a very famous philosopher, in fact died of precisely this phenomenon. He got an implant infection and it was aggressive. I was very lucky, mine was an indolent bacteria, which meant that it was slow and not very active and not likely to spread through the rest of my body. So I had enough time to arrange for a surgeon in New York City Hospital for Special Surgery. This is a very interesting character. He belonged to a family, a Brahmin family. The father had invented a whole series of knee transplants and hip transplants. He had two sons. One son did only knee transplants, the other son did only hip transplants. Well, I obviously got the knee transplant guy. He was a rock star surgeon, and so the problem was that as soon as I got down to New York, just about a year ago now, I had the first knee artifice taken out and went on to a regimen of severe antibiotics, which were specifically geared to my indolent type of bacteria. 5 weeks of this with a ceramic spacer, which I could walk with a ceramic spacer about like this. Then, of course, I had to wait for the rockstar surgeon to have an opening, and that took another several months. And so finally, last year in mid-November, I got my new knee replacement, and which is followed up by several months of radical physical therapy, et cetera, et cetera. And now, while I can do better than this, I'm still a slow walker. And of course, I was told with typical contingencies that redos are never as good as first dos. So now, what I also learned in this process was that the unicompartmental thing was usually not given to old people, but they had improved the technology such that the unicompartmentals usually would now last in contemporary world 15 to 20 years, and they figured I wouldn't live any more than 15 to 20 years, so that was okay. Now, what all of this does, of course, inversely, is to point to embodiment as having a real body. You can become a partial cyborg, but we're nowhere near brain transplants or anything of that sort. I suspect we never will be. Secondly, of course, is that cyborgization is obviously better than dying or having amputation or not being well. So the point for philosophy of technology is everything of this sort is a trade-off. And it's a trade-off with calculated contingencies. And it's clear that if you look at the recent history of medicine, again with the Ihde phenomenon that CERN is talking about, it's incredibly better. I've also had open heart surgery, and within 6 weeks after open heart surgery, I was on the road, first to Rotterdam and then to Japan, etc., with all of the old energy returning. And the same good news with my aging cyborg status is I finished my book this summer on Husserl's missing technologies. Husserl, it turns out, disappointingly, not only doesn't talk about technologies very much, but when he talks about things like scientific instruments, he talks about telescope things and microscope things which yield perceptual correlates. And of course, I realized immediately that Husserl always had glasses, and that his eyesight deteriorated with age. So are the glasses things? Do they yield perceptual correlates, or does he see Landgraven through his glasses? I think the thing that the later phenomenologists, including Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, did realize is that in use, technologies are experienced very, very differently. And Peter Paul, as everybody knows, added cyborg relations to the set of human technology relations. I had actually thought of adding something like that in the technology life period at Husserl briefly, but since I hadn't anything more serious than a tooth crown, I wasn't able to do much. Now I'm much more thoroughly cyborgian, so I have great sympathy to that as well. Okay, so that's the story about why post-phenomenologists should be very skeptical of old-fashioned transhumanism.